The night finally surrendered to the agonizingly slow approach of dawn, though the transition felt entirely wrong. Deep, bruised blues and stagnant purples bled artificially into heavy shades of burnt orange and crimson, yet the sun itself refused to clear the horizon. Above the armory's jagged stone parapets, a flock of black birds circled relentlessly in the heavy sky, their harsh squawks and rhythmic croaks piercing the morning air. No, it wasn't a crisp morning. It was cold, a vigorous, unnatural cold that seemed to hang suspended in the stagnant atmosphere, clawing through fabric and biting at bare flesh. Rian found himself following blindly in the heavy, rhythmic footsteps of Varric, his mind a chaotic vortex. Subconsciously, he wrapped his arms tightly around his chest and shivered violently, though no one else seemed to notice the plummeting temperature. The courtyard was suddenly teeming with far more men than had occupied it hours ago. Arrayed directly in front of him stood two perfectly uniform lines of soldiers, all clad in the familiar, heavy iron and muted colors of his vanguard company. A dozen of them stood frozen, stationed facing entirely away from the armory toward the lower paths. Varric, without a word of consultation, slid effortlessly into his spot at the absolute head of the company. The nameless soldier who had fetched them from the subterranean depths took up a matching, rigid position opposite the giant knight. To Rian's profound surprise, old Zarek was there too. The elder stood a few meters away from the military formation, his weathered face shadowed, as he silently studied the tense goings-on of the gathering crowd. Before Rian could even open his mouth to assert his authority, a booming voice rose from the front of the line, shattering the morning silence. "To the gate, now, men!" The company snapped into motion, marching with a steady, mechanical pace. Rian stood completely frozen in the dirt, his boots rooted to the spot, entirely unsure of whether or not to follow the column. A surge of cognitive dissonance struck him like a physical blow. Shouldn't he be the one leading this company to the gate? He was the general. This was his vanguard. Yet Varric had moved without a single backward glance. And more importantly, what cosmic horror or enemy force was currently waiting at the main threshold of Nostrador? Breaking out of his paralysis, Rian aggressively moved to Zarek's side, his hand dropping to the pommel of his blade. "What's happening at the gate?" he demanded, his voice clipped. Zarek didn't turn his head. He kept his fading eyes fixed intently on the passing line of iron-clad soldiers. "Ah, nothing for you to worry about, son," the old man replied smoothly. Great, another vague, hollow answer, Rian thought bitterly. The lingering curiosity that had sustained him since waking was rapidly giving way to a dangerous, burning frustration. He looked around desperately, wondering if Garth was trapped in the same web of ignorance. The young soldier had just joined the perimeter of the two men, but his appearance offered no comfort. Garth looked completely undone, his posture shaken, his eyes unfocused and bloodshot. Rian watched as Garth stared intensely at the stone ground beneath his boots, his fingers twitching rhythmically at his sides, acting strangely terrified for a man who was supposed to be on the winning side of the conflict. "You okay?" Rian asked, stepping into Garth's line of sight. Garth didn't respond. He didn't even blink or gesture to signify that a human voice had cut through his internal panic. "Garth?" Rian asked again, sharper this time, grabbing the young man's shoulder. Garth jolted violently, his eyes darting quickly, frantically in Rian's direction before losing focus again. He rubbed the back of his neck, forcing a hollow plastic laugh that scraped against his throat. "Sorry. Long night, sir. Just a bloody long night." Without waiting for Rian or the old man to reply, Garth strolled on lazily ahead, his boots dragging in the dirt as he followed the tail end of the marching column. Rian lunged forward to pursue him, but a heavy, surprisingly unyielding hand clamped down on his forearm, holding him firmly in place. Zarek was staring at him, his expression an artificial mask of grandfatherly concern. "They have this handled, General. Why don't you go clean yourself up a bit, son? Eh?" His eyes drifted pointedly around Rian's disheveled person, lingering on the dried alien blood and battlefield grit coating his leather vest. The suggestion felt like an insult. Surely whatever tactical emergency was unfolding at the main gates was infinitely more important than Rian's personal cleanliness. A dark, hot anger bubbled up in his chest, his fingers instinctively curling into his palms tightly enough to turn his knuckles white. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to draw the sword at his hip. But the military training hidden in his muscles took over. He forcibly lowered his tense posture, smoothed his expression into a deceptive air of calm, and forced a compliant smile. "Yeah, you're right," Rian said, the lie tasting like ash. Zarek smiled back, a relieved, crinkled expression that didn't seem to reach his cold eyes. The old man turned toward the steep stone steps that led up the climbing slope of the fortress and pointed with a bony finger. "Here, take my key," Zarek said, reaching into his tunic and pulling out a heavy iron key attached to a frayed piece of twine. "You can freshen up in my wee abode, just to the right of the tavern, remember?" Rian took the metal, the key feeling impossibly heavy against his palm. "On you go, then. I shall come and find you the very moment I hear anything of worth," Zarek promised, turning on his heel to follow the last of the soldiers down the sweeping courtyard path toward the outer walls. Rian paused for a long, quiet moment, staring down at the key in his hands before looking toward the dark, winding path that led to the gates. The deception was transparent now. It was entirely clear to him that the leadership of Nostrudor Varek, Zarek, perhaps even Sigrid, did not want him present. They were actively hiding the reality of the gate from his sight. "But I am going to see it," he resolved, regardless of who commands otherwise. Turning away from the column, he took the stone stairs that led up the slope. To the climbing right lay the path toward Sigrid's house and the upper solar, but he veered sharply to the left, following the parallel high path that skirted the outer rim of the settlement toward the gatehouses. His pace was quick and deliberate, but measured enough to avoid drawing the suspicion of any sentries posted at the intersections. The caution proved entirely unnecessary. As he traversed the upper walkways, he passed several civilians and low-ranking guards. Not a single soul gave him so much as a passing glance, a nod, or an acknowledgement of his rank. They looked right through him, their faces pale and vacant. Eventually, the familiar silhouette of the tavern loomed out of the morning mist, the stag and bull sign hanging limply from its iron bracket, entirely motionless in the biting wind. To its right sat Zarek's small stone cottage, its facade furnished with a rotting wooden door and two small square window cutouts that stared out like blind eyes. For a fraction of a second, Rian hesitated. The iron key felt like ice against his skin. He clenched his fist around it, burying it in his pocket, and pushed past the house without stopping. "Definitely this direction," he muttered, tracking the memory of the fortress layout. Every few dozen paces, he would pause at the mouths of narrow stone alleys that sloped steeply downhill to his left, but they revealed nothing but absolute darkness and weeping masonry. But as he pressed onward, the titanic stone parapets of Nostrador's outer defensive walls finally peered over the horizon of the rooftops, cutting a jagged line against the orange sky. He didn't have a concrete plan. His immediate instinct was simply to get as close to the operational heart of the gate as possible, while remaining hidden, and then improvise based on what he discovered. If necessary, he reasoned he could disguise himself as a common wall sentry. He was already dressed in the standard armor of the vanguard, lacking only the full iron helm. The narrow street suddenly terminated, giving way to a wide, open road that swept down toward the left. Looming behind the buildings in front of him stood the outer curtain wall. Thick, ancient stone, stretching for what looked like miles in either direction, towering several meters into the sky. From the base of the wall, the heavy sounds of military movement drifted upward. The distinct shuffling of iron plate, the settling of shields, and the low murmurs of a tense deployment. The company had arrived. Peering around the edge of a stone granary, Rian could see the soldiers from earlier. They were arrayed in a tight defensive formation before the iron portcullis, holding their spears rigid, their shields locked behind a single massive silhouette. Varek. Garth was nowhere to be seen in the immediate line. A large crowd of civilians was already beginning to pool where the road met the open gate courtyard, men, women, and even small children, all murmuring with a bizarre electric curiosity. Even the guardsmen officially on duty on the lower ground seemed entirely distracted by the spectacle unfolding beyond the iron bars. To Rian's immediate right, the dark, arched entrance to one of the rounded wall parapets spiraled upward to the top of the battlements. There, he thought, that's my way in. Fortunately, the sentry who was supposed to be guarding the stairwell had abandoned his post, currently swept up in the fray of physically pushing the eager civilian crowd away from the military perimeter. Rian slipped into the shadows of the archway and began to climb. The tight, circular pattern of the ascending stone steps felt like a sickening mirror of the dungeon stairs he had descended hours ago, winding upward into the cold. Reaching the first open-air exit, he pressed his back flat against the freezing masonry, peering down the length of the high walkway. Empty. Not a single guard adorned the battlements directly above the gate. It was entirely deserted. The distant, echoing chatter of voices drifted up from the courtyard below. Something was happening. Keeping his posture low, Rian crept toward the outer edge of the wall. He knelt beside the heavy stone crenellations, finding a narrow gap in the masonry, and thrust his vision outward to scan the wilderness beyond the fortress. His breath caught in his throat, a wave of sheer disbelief washing over him. "You have got to be kidding me," he whispered. The tactical view he had hoped for was completely obstructed. The massive stone curtain wall of Nostrudor was heavily lined with colossal ancient trees whose thick, weeping branches and massive trunks clung to the exterior masonry, dropping all the way to the unseen valley floor below. He couldn't see a single thing on the lower ground. It was an absolute wall of dense, dark green foliage. Only when the violent, freezing wind occasionally rustled through the heavy canopy, forcing brief gaps in the leaves, could he catch fleeting, fractured glimpses of the dirt road below the gate. "It's fine," Rian told himself, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I don't need to see them. I just need to hear." He pressed his ear closer to the stone gap, focusing his absolute attention on the audio floating up from the gatehouse floor. Varric was the dominant voice, speaking from the interior side of the iron portcullis, his tone commanding, strong, and laced with an aggressive, mocking edge. The knight's rough, gravelly delivery made it difficult to comprehend every syllable through the stone, but the core of the interaction was unmistakable. Varric was aggressively demanding answers, his voice echoing off the valley walls. He was barking questions. "Why are you here? What is it you think you want? Why should we listen to a single word from your mouths?" Rian tuned out the night, far more desperate to hear the responses from the mysterious party on the other side of the iron bars. Through the rustling leaves he caught the faint, distinct neighing of horses and the rhythmic clacking of hooves shifting on loose gravel. The speakers below were mounted on horseback. Every time the wind whipped the branches aside, Rian strained his eyes through the gap. He could swear the riders below wore deep green and shimmering gold, though his mind whispered it could easily be an illusion born of the surrounding foliage. Finally, the lead rider at the gate raised his voice, the tone clear, resonant, and carrying a profound, heavy weight that cut through the noise of the courtyard. "I have told you already," the rider stated, the words vibrating with a calm, dangerous authority. "Return our captives to us, and we will leave this valley in peace." Why is that concept so incredibly difficult to understand? Even for your kind. A dead silence hung for a beat, and then Varric erupted into a roaring, booming laugh. A second later, the entire company of soldiers joined in unison. It wasn't the boisterous, camaraderie-filled laughter Rian had heard in the armory. It was a bestial, phlegmy, rumbling chortle that sounded entirely devoid of humanity. "Our kind! Our kind!" Varric barked back, his voice dripping with venomous amusement. "That's rich coming from a corpse on a horse." There was a stark pause in the exchange, just long enough for the echoing mockery of the soldiers to fade into the wind. "What's in it for us, eh?" Varric demanded, his tone shifting to a transactional growl. "Why should we give you a damn thing?" Rian's stomach churned. Even without seeing Varric's face, he could tell the giant knight cared absolutely nothing for the diplomatic interaction. No matter what terms the riders offered, Varric had already decided to dismiss every single line of negotiation. "I should be down there," Rian thought, a sudden spike of guilt piercing his chest. "I am the general. I should be holding the keys to this parley. An end to this war of senseless death and loss," the rider muttered from the darkness of the canopy, his voice carrying an undeniable, crushing wave of sadness. "War? Rian repeated the word internally, his lips moving silently against the cold stone. Was this truly how far the conflict had escalated? Everything his fractured memory had gathered so far pointed to isolated skirmishes, raids on camps, defensive actions where he had received his head injury. But now, he was hearing the explicit mention of a full-scale war. A profound sense of unease and anxiety began to wrap around his chest like iron bands. Varric spoke up once again, his booming voice shattering the brief solemnity. "The war will end the very moment you and your pathetic kin pack up your remaining gear, leave this land forever, climb back down from your damned mountain and beg for a swift death, or go swim in the silver seas to the south and drown that way. We don't care which." There it was. Rian's darkest assumptions were confirmed in a single sentence. Varric was entirely closed to any terms short of the total, systematic annihilation of the people outside the walls. Had the night always been this monstrous? Rian searched the blank spaces of his mind, finding nothing. Ever since he had awoken, he had trusted these people simply because they were the only faces he knew. His grip tightened on the stone parapet, the rough masonry scraping his fingers. He turned his eyes back toward the sprawling stone city of Nostrudor behind him, wondering how many of the civilians standing in the streets had lost their sons, daughters, and parents to this meat grinder. For the first time since opening his eyes in the solar, he desperately wished he could remember what he used to believe. Would the old me have agreed with Varric's savagery? No, he whispered into the wind. He knew the answer with an absolute, instinctual certainty before the thought could even fully form in his mind. The people beyond the gate did not sound like the slavering, hostile monsters Varric had described. If anything, their presence here felt like a direct defensive reaction to what Rian's own vanguard had inflicted upon them during the midnight raid. But then, why did one of them attack me so viciously on the ridge? Why did Adora slice my forehead? His looping thoughts were violently cut short as the lead rider spoke once more, his tone hardening into steel. "We have absolutely no wish to kill your people, but we will defend our homeland again." Again? Rian frantically tried to piece the fragments of dialogue together, but the larger picture remained stubbornly hidden in the fog of his amnesia. Yet that single word lodged itself deep within his thoughts like a splinter. Defend, not conquer, not invade. Defend. It was a bizarre, telling choice of words for a race he had been told was an existential threat to Nostrudor. Below, Varric turned and muttered something low to one of the nearby guardsmen. Rian failed to catch the exact command through the rustle of the trees, but he distinctly heard the heavy tread of the soldier's boots, taking up a quick, hurried stride back toward the interior of the city. The wind picked up with a sudden, violent gust, sending a brutal chill right through Rian's armor. He shivered violently, his teeth clicking together. Why was the weather turning so aggressively cold? He carefully shifted his position along the parapet wall, peering over the internal edge to look down at the civilian crowd and the ranks of soldiers directly below. Not a single soul in the courtyard was reacting to the freezing temperature. They stood in their light tunics and iron mail as if the air were perfectly balmy. Rian turned back to face the outer wilderness, kneeling once again in the shadow of the stone gap. A minute later, the hurried footsteps of the messenger returned to the gatehouse floor, but he wasn't alone. He was hauling cargo. Through the stone opening, the sound of a body being brutally dragged across the gravel echoed upward. Bound tightly by a thick rope wrapped around their wrists, the prisoner was being pulled forcefully behind the soldier. It was one of the captured elves from the subterranean cells. The moment the prisoner was dragged into the open space before the portcullis, the civilian crowd erupted into a terrifying, deafening cacophony of vicious boos, jeers, and animalistic hisses. "Ah, look here. Here is one of your glorious folk, I believe," Varric shouted through the iron bars, his hand violently ripping the rope upward to force the prisoner to their knees. "Come now, be a good lad and say your name to your friends." The captive didn't utter a sound, their eyes firmly glued to the dirt in silent defiance. Rian strained his eyes through the shifting leaves, his vision blurred by a sudden terrifying realization. Adora! The thought hit him like a physical blow, His heart leapt violently into his throat, and a profuse hot sweat began to pour from his forehead despite the biting cold. A sudden panic flustered his senses. In his mind, he knew he desperately needed to extract the truth from her. But if Varric was about to hand her back to the elven host, he would lose his only link to his past forever. But why would Varric willingly surrender a high-ranking captive after showing such bloodlust? Nothing was adding up. The pieces of the puzzle were entirely mismatched. In a flash of sheer anxiety, Rian's hand flew down to the hilt of his sword. The grip fit his palm with that same impossible, flawless perfection. He looked down at his waist. His mouth fell open in mute surprise as he stared at the sheath. It was the ornate, ancient weapon from the armory table, the silver dryad blade. This is her sword, he realized, a cold sweat breaking out across his spine. Why the hell am I carrying it? He tried to frantically reconstruct the sequence of events from earlier Garth's catatonic state in the armory. The blinding flourish that had shattered the wooden table, the sudden aggressive interruption of Varric. Before he could follow the memory to its conclusion, the sound of sudden movement below snapped his attention back to the parley. One of the elven delegates on the outside had violently dismounted their horse and was sprinting directly toward the iron bars of the gate. It wasn't the lead rider who had been conversing with Varric. It was someone from the secondary vanguard hidden within the tree line. A sharp, agonized woman's voice shattered the courtyard noise, screaming out in pure, unadulterated pain. "No, not my son! Give him back to me, you vile, broken—" The woman's scream abruptly ceased, cut off in a choking gasp as she witnessed the massive guard holding the rope draw a long, rusty dagger and press the jagged edge directly against the young elven boy's throat as a silent warning. Varric chimed in, his voice dangerously smooth, low, and dripping with sadistic pleasure. "Back off, lady. One more step and we paint the gravel." Rian let out a long, trembling sigh of relief, his shoulders slumping against the cold stone. It wasn't Adora. The young captive was a male elf. He didn't know where that sudden, intense wave of relief had come from. At this moment, Adora was technically nothing to him, just a dangerous prisoner and a blank space in his amnesia. Below, the bloodthirsty roar of the civilian crowd died down into a sea of faint whisperings and tense, static noises. A heavy air of anticipation settled over the folk in the courtyard. Rian could feel the collective breath of the city catching. It felt as though no one truly knew what was about to transpire. Or perhaps, he thought with a creeping dread, they knew exactly what was coming. "We will back off, okay? We are backing away," the lead rider commanded sharply, reaching down from his mount to firmly grasp the arm of the distraught elven woman, pulling her back into the safety of their lines. "There is absolutely no need for further bloodshed today." "Attaboy," Varric chuckled, lowering the rusty knife from the boy's throat back to his waist, though his massive hand maintained an iron grip on the binding ropes. "You know exactly what we want from your mountain. It is simply a question of whether or not your kind knows how to obey a superior order." The lead rider nudged his horse forward a few slow paces, bringing the beast directly against the outer edge of the iron portcullis, face to face with the massive knight on the interior. The rider leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, desperate whisper that barely carried up to the battlements. "And what of our prince? What of his status?" An absolute, suffocating silence dropped over the entire courtyard. Varric did not stir an inch. The soldiers stood like stone monuments. The crowd ceased their whispering. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. Varric let out a short, sharp bark of laughter. "You lost that privilege the moment you crossed our border," the knight growled. With a blinding casual velocity, Varric violently yanked the prisoner's head back by his hair, raised the rusty dagger, and sliced the boy's throat cleanly from ear to ear. The courtyard below instantly erupted. A massive gasp tore through a portion of the crowd, but it was immediately drowned out by a sickening cacophony of frenzied cheers, wild clapping, and yells of roaring agreement from the civilians of Nostrador. What did he just do?" Rian screamed internally, his mind fracturing at the sheer, unprovoked brutality of the act. Something monstrous had just occurred on the ground floor. The agonizing, sky-rending scream of the elven mother echoed through the trees, a sound of pure, absolute anguish that made Rian's blood run cold. He violently flung his body across the stone walkway, switching sides to peer directly down into the interior courtyard where the crowd stood. Through the gaps in the internal scaffolding, he caught sight of 2 vanguard soldiers casually hauling a fresh corpse away from the gatehouse floor. The body left a glaring, vibrant smear of thick, scarlet blood behind it in the dirt, a sickening, horrific contrast to the pale, ghost-like, unblinking faces of the surrounding populace. Not a single civilian seemed remotely fazed or disturbed by the execution they had just witnessed. In fact, it was the exact opposite. There were young children scattered throughout the front ranks of the gathering, clapping their tiny hands frantically, their faces split into wide, joyous smiles as if they had just witnessed a comedic jester performing a clever magic trick at a festival. Rian felt a violent wave of nausea hit his stomach. He pressed his hand against his mouth, his knees shaking beneath his armor. This was an uncalled-for slaughter. The captive boy had been entirely unarmed, bound, and defenseless. The riders outside had shown no active hostility or aggression during the parley. They had offered peace in exchange for their people. Where was Garth in all of this? Rian thought desperately, his eyes scanning the crowd. Surely the young man would have spoken up. Or Zarek. Anyone with a shred of sanity. But there was only the cheering wall of pale faces. Outside the walls, the distant thud of hooves signaled the rapid retreat of the elven delegation. As they turned their mounts to head back into the uncharted wilderness from whence they came, the wind violently parted the heavy tree canopy one final time, allowing Rian to finally see them clearly. They were arrayed in stunning, brilliant green and gold, their long cloaks flowing elegantly against the backs of their horses as they galloped into the mist, caught the pale morning light. At the absolute head of the retreating column, a rider held a tall wooden banner aloft, its fabric snapping in the wind. Rian squinted through the stone gap, his eyes locking onto the embroidered gold symbol emblazoned upon the green field, a rough geometric triangle surrounded at its base by stylized rolling clouds. A mountain, he realized, the sign of their people, the sign of the Dryads. Below, the civilian crowd began to slowly disperse, talking cheerfully among themselves as the uniform formation of vanguard soldiers turned to march back through the courtyard and up the main stone streets. Rian knew he needed to leave the battlements immediately before a patrol spotted him, but he found absolutely no physical energy or mental motivation to force himself to his feet. He remained slumped against the freezing stone wall, his hands trembling. What was his next step in this nightmare? His chaotic thoughts drifted back to the deep dungeon, dwelling entirely on Adora. Should he even be thinking about her? She was the enemy, technically. In his head, a strategic voice told him he needed to immediately confront Varric, to demand to know what the horrific display at the gate was truly about, and what terms were being hidden from him. But his heart, and the deep, ancient muscle memory humming within the dryad blade at his hip, told him something entirely different. He needed to go back down to the dark cells. He needed to speak to the elven prisoner once more. Alone. Without Varric's shadow looming over the iron bars. Taking in a deep, shuddering breath of the vigorous morning air, Rian finally pulled his aching body up to his feet. He adjusted the stolen sheath at his waist, took one final lingering look out at the wide, shrouded lands of Aetheria before him, and watched the faint dust trail of the galloping horses slowly vanish into the frozen horizon.